Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The last people take their seats. A very warm welcome to an Oxford Water Network event, which is being hosted here at the Oxford Martin School as part of the Resource Stewardship Programme. My name's Rob Hope. I'm from the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and I'm going to moderate the session today. We are live streaming, so I would like both the speakers and the audience to reflect on that fact as they engage over the next hour and a half until 5:30. At that point, there'll be a drinks reception next door where we'll be able to continue the discussion from there. Today's session, we're going to talk about Africa, dams, and development. And the question I'm asking the speakers to reflect upon to start out the discussion is how Africa can better balance often competing conflicts between economic growth, environmental sustainability, and human development. In Africa at the moment, less than 10% of the hydroelectric power potential is developed, but there are major and accelerating programs and planned programs to change this, whether in the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, the High Fall Grand Ham Falls in Kenya, Inga 3 in DRC, Kandaji in Niger. These are happening, but no two dams are the same. They vary significantly in the scale, the capacity, the costs, human, environmental, or financial, and also in terms of the uses of the dams, whether they're for irrigation, for flood, for municipal water supply, or flood control. To frame these issues, we have a distinguished panel of speakers sitting before me here who are drawn from academia and from practitioner space and civil society. I'd like to invite them up in just a second to give a brief 5-minute reflections on some of these key ideas that will then open to the audience. The way in which we'll structure the day or the afternoon is that the speakers will have approximately 40-45 minutes just to frame the issues before the audience can participate. So we'll have a good balance between the speakers and the audience. In reverse order, I'd like to welcome Dr. David Turton from the Africa Study Centre at Oxford University, Jamie Skinner from the International Institute for Environment and Development, Judith Plummer from Cambridge University, Dr. Atif Ansar from the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, Professor Michael Norton from AMAC Foster Wheeler, and our first speaker, Professor David Gray, who's based at the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. David, would you like to come up?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Only yesterday I was on the Mekong, a place where there are many debates about dams as we speak. I'm going to speak about why we're talking about dams, why we're talking about what might be a problem instead of talking about what are the objectives, why is it that we might need dams, what are the problems we're trying to solve. My starting point, Africa is deeply water insecure today, deeply. I lived in Africa for nearly 15 years. I worked on Africa for about 40 years, and I've worked in almost every country in Africa. We have exceptionally high variability. Interannual and intra-annual variability between the tropics and Africa exceeds that of any other region on the planet, as far as we know. And we're examining that. And this is Ethiopia. This is a study, it's a World Bank study. It's a study that I was involved in about 10 years ago. And you're the finance minister of Ethiopia. How do you manage a budget when you can't predict the rain and the budget, your growth, basically tracks rainfall? So what do you do each year when you plan your budget spend, when you don't know whether the rain is coming or not, whether you'll have positive growth or negative growth? This is an article published by a group of us here at Oxford in Science about 3 weeks ago. The x-axis is what we call the hydrological complexity. It's a coefficient of variation of rainfall over 35 years, monthly runoff, runoff. And the y-axis are investments in storage and in institutional capacity, both. And what we find are the richest countries in the world are in green, the poorest in red. Up in the top left-hand corner are rich countries, down in the bottom right-hand corner are poor countries. So countries with simple hydrologies and high investments in water security have high incomes, and the opposite is true. Countries with complex hydrologies and low investments have low incomes. Sorry. And this, I put this on top here. This is the Nile. These are 7 credible climate models. What we can see here are projections out to more or less the same period, showing an increase in rain of about 200 millimeters and a decrease. So the model variation we have is not telling us anything. And a similar set of models would give very good convergence in northern climates. Africa is food insecure today. It needs irrigation. It needs irrigation badly, and irrigation needs storage. So this is a map of irrigation areas on the planet, and we can see that the one part of the world that needs irrigation more than any other part of the world is white. So area equipped for irrigation and percentage of land area is mostly 0. So food security, food insecurity across Africa. Africa's energy insecure today. It needs electricity, it needs light. So untapped, low-carbon, renewable hydropower needs storage. Africa, a dark continent, literally. So this shows both capacity installed and undeveloped and generation, both. If we look at Africa, 92% not developed. Europe, 47% not developed of hydro potential. On that plot here, over from 1965 to 2009, Africa is the little black line in the middle, below the blue line at the top. Europe is the brown, North America, the brown at the bottom. Europe and Eurasia is the light fawn. Africa, almost none of its hydro potential developed. Growing populations, growing cities, growing industries, demand for water to maintain all of these. So by 2050, 1 person in 5 on the planet will be an African living in Africa. By 2100, 1 person in 3 on the planet will be an African living in Africa. 3.5 billion people. When I went to live in Africa in 1973, there were 350 million people living in Africa. Cities. So this is Lagos growing out to 16 million people by 2025, in just 10 years. These cities are going to need water that is stored in order to mitigate variability, to encourage investment, to encourage industry, and to support growth. Africa needs storage for development, and there's a role for dams, of course. If we look at this plot, and this is my last slide, we're just given 4.9 minutes, I'm told by Rob. Just cast your eye upon this map for a moment, please. This is a map of large dams. Look at Britain. Please look at Britain. Look at Africa. Are we honestly suggesting? Are we saying, do what I say, not what I did? I mean, in Wales, when I was a young hydrologist, in Wales, we were driving Welsh hill farmers off the land at the point of a truncheon. Welsh marching in Westminster. And out of this rose a new political party, Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, in the 1970s. So it's not very far back in our history we forget this. And I have a little bit of a thesis here, and that is that most wealthy people look only at the costs of dams, which are mostly short-run and can still be significant. Most primarily poor people, look at the benefits of dams, which are long-run and can be significant. And I very rarely read articles coming out of northern universities which speak about benefits. They only speak about costs. I noticed, Rob, by the way, when you spoke about the costs of dams, not the benefits of dams. We need to look at both. And my thesis is store what? What do we need to store? We must have storage. We could store food. We could store energy. We could store water. We could store money. Any of those things to achieve the goal. Where could we store it? We could store it in lakes, in wetlands, in groundwater, and in reservoirs. All of those. Does Africa need dams? It certainly does. There's absolutely no question whatsoever. But it needs good dams, not bad dams. And there are many, many bad dams. And we've learned over the last 100 years, because we've learned from experience, because we've built so many bad ones ourselves. So let's make sure we transfer that experience and not try and block, but try and support and make sure these things are done well. There will always be trade-offs. I speak here about a smart systems approach, minimizing costs and maximizing multi-purpose benefits. That's the other thing. Almost all dams, the dams in Pakistan, Tarbela is not a hydropower dam, it's a storage dam. It was built for the Indus Basin Treaty signed in 1960, and it regulates the flows of the main stem of the Indus to put water into link canals to take the water east into rivers that are dry because they've been given to India. So the Ravi, the Sutlej, and the Beas are Indian rivers. They're bone dry at the border. Without Tarbela, Pakistan would not be the country we know today. It produces hydropower as a byproduct. So let's learn from the 23,427 large dams worldwide, very few of which are in Africa, and help Africa to store in order to mitigate variability, to store food, maybe, to store money, to store energy, but also to store water in surface and in groundwater storage systems. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. What have I let myself in for in joining this distinguished panel this evening? I may be wrong, but I believe I may be the only civil engineer amongst the panel, and I suspect I may be the token build 'em whatever role on the panel. But let's see if that's what pans out. In my 5 allotted minutes, I'm going to try to keep to the basics. I am an engineer. How is it built? What are the problems? And I'm going to talk a bit about costs and why they overrun. But I'll steer clear of hydrology, for example. So let me move on. Let's start by looking at the types of dam. And I'm sorry if those of you in the audience already know this, but I think it's just worth looking at what are the 4 basic types of structure. So they are the gravity dam, the arch dam, the buttress dam, and the embankment dam. They're all for specific types of topography, foundation conditions, and valley shape, and availability of materials to build them. We see lots of hybrids between these 4, but these are the 4 fundamental types. But there are other types of dam, and here the terminology begins to get confusing. Recharge dams are much smaller structures, and their intent is not so much to cause the storage of the water at the surface, but to divert the water into groundwater. Barrages and levees are different types of dam structures. Barrages often combined with hydroelectric power. Levees generally are embankment dams used for containing floodwater. And then bottom right corner, managed aquifer recharge, which I'll come back to, another form of storage. So, why do these large dams cost so much to construct? The data here on the left of Caribe, Tarbela, Gran Cule, and Tucuri in Brazil, you can see the numbers are extraordinary. We're talking about billions of pounds, billions of dollars to construct these dams. It's thought that there are about, David, I got a figure of 45,000 large dams around the world, defined as a dam with a height greater than 15 meters. And it was in the latter half of the last century that we saw that the scale of construction and a number of these dams become ever more ambitious. And then we saw problems with construction associated with the foundations of the dams and with the structures themselves because of the materials. And worse still, the flow of funds into these enormous projects became a magnet for less transparent business activity and enrichment of those in positions of power. By the mid-1990s, it was evident that these factors alone meant that the way in which large dams were conceived, planned and constructed needed to be reviewed. And as a result of that, the World Commission on Dams was put into place in 1998, World Bank and United Nations. Now, in their report in 2000, the World Commission on Dams found that the performance of dam-related water projects was highly variable. Performance in terms of what their output was going to be of energy or irrigation or water. And that there was a history of poor accountability of their social and environmental impacts of construction. And they recommended, back in 2000, a new decision-making framework based around 5 principles: equity, sustainability, efficiency, participatory engagement, and accountability. That report in 2000 was followed by another report in 2003, interestingly from the World Wildlife Fund, who published their Guide to Investors. And that was interesting because it was clear that big investors were getting interested in these projects. And the WWF report attempted to give them a checklist around costs, benefits, and risks. So, where are we now in Africa? Well, it's thought that there are between 600 and 800 large dams in Africa. Now, whether or not that's of the 27,000 that David mentioned or the 45,000 that I've mentioned, it's a pretty small proportion. And yet, this is a continent which overall has not so far off the world average of rainfall and about 10% of the world's renewable water resources. And I think, therefore, that you can conclude that the available water resources are relatively untapped in comparison, say, to Europe and Asia. And one could conclude that there's great potential for construction of dams across this continent. So where do I, as a practicing civil engineer, stand on this debate about dams and development in Africa? Well, first and foremost, I have a strong belief that storing water at times when it's plentiful for use at times when it isn't, is an extremely effective and sustainable technique to meet mankind's drinking, food and energy needs. And if it can be stored at a higher elevation, it has even more benefit. Now, in the African context, there is bound to be continued interest in constructing large dams, and I support this principle conceptually. That said, I would always urge that other forms of water storage should be investigated, such as recharge dams or managed aquifer recharge. And I think that all potential storage configurations should be fully investigated in terms of costs, risks, and benefits. And finally, I think that each water storage need, coming back to David's need to talk about the solution first, each water storage need should be assessed in the local social, environmental, and physical context. And it's incumbent of those who are expert advisors not to carry preconditioned views on what the right answer is until that assessment is carried out. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Atif Ansar. I'm at the Blavatnik School of Government. The message I have to deliver to you today is dams are simply not worth the cost. And I'd like to start a sensible conversation about alternatives. We reached this conclusion by the most extensive study of large dams ever conducted, which is 245 large dams over 15 meters high. All the data for any dam that we could lay our hands on was included in this study. One thing I must mention, it's very difficult to find reliable and valid data on both the ex ante and ex post costs of dams. This in its own right is a finding. There's a great deal of obfuscation when it comes to costs of large projects. All the projects we looked at were publicly funded. It is disturbing that even in democracies, we cannot find data after extensive inquiries, which nearly took us 4 years. So first thing to fix is we need much better baseline and ex post cost data available for us to make these sensible judgments. The one thing we did do is we used theories of psychology to assess the data, because a pattern noted in psychology literature is that people are systematically biased about their choices. And they tend to be optimistic. So if you're doing a grocery run, you might think it's going to take you 15 minutes, but in actuality, it takes you 30 minutes. And we wanted to detect whether this hypothesis that psychologists have found with tasks, routine tasks, but also big tasks, panned out with large dams, and if yes, to what magnitude. So we looked at 245 dams across the world, including several dams in Africa, and Project Vintage. I'm happy to share further details during question and answer. What we found astounded us. Cost overruns are a bit like maternal love. They're everywhere. Except in transportation, we find that they are in 9 out of 10 projects, but the magnitude tends to be a lot lower. With large dams, 3 out of 4 large dams suffer a cost overrun, but the magnitude is tremendous. On average, 90% cost overruns, and the tail is very fat. So if these were rational decisions, you would experience, or you would expect, a cost overrun of 0% with a normal distribution around the 0%. So you expect about half the dams to have an underrun, and about half the dams to have an overrun, and the two might cancel each other out with an overall cost overrun of 0%. But what we're experiencing instead, what we're observing, is a massively skewed distribution with cost overruns on the x-axis and some astounding cost overruns with up to 5,000%. One of the reasons people can't stop building dams, even once they start going wrong, is that they are a binary asset. You either have a dam or you don't have a dam. A 90% complete dam is a dam not built at all. It's as valueless. And a lot of the problems emerge in the last 10%. Now, the politicians that approved these dams would look mighty stupid if they abandon a dam in the last 10% of its construction. In economics literature, that's typically called lock-in or escalation of commitment. A lot of these dams suffer from similar escalation of commitment, throwing good money after bad. There is no learning. There is no adaptive rationality in the system either. Dams built in the 1930s, in fact, going as far back as 1911, suffered equally poor outcomes as dams built today. That's saying there's really no reason for us to be optimistic about the fact that new technology is going to improve dam construction, proposed dam construction. It's a global phenomenon. Africa doesn't do that poorly, but it's not that much better either. Former Soviet Union, except the data sample is very small, does the worst. North America has a much better performance. However, we ought to be careful not to anchor too much into North American stories. So next time you hear somebody telling you, oh, Hoover Dam worked out all right, A, the data are obfuscated. We cannot collect the true costs and benefits of Hoover Dam. Second, North America seems to be the exception rather than the rule. So I'd be careful in making those cross-country comparisons. And the global reference class should be kept in view. In terms of schedule, the outcomes are, again, asymmetric and adverse. So dams take a long time to build, as another speaker is going to talk about, and they suffer tremendous delays. On average, a 44% delay, and 8 out of 10 dams are delayed. What that simply means is not only the costs really high, but the benefits do not come online when they are required. I come from Pakistan originally. We had tremendous flooding in 2010. If you started building a dam in Pakistan today, it would take you up till 2021 to bring it online. That means 10 years of flooding for the farmers that are waiting for that dam to appear. They'll be dead by then. The dam is not going to help them. So we need solutions that can bridge that gap, the need for those benefits immediately. So the challenge of big, in essence, is that they become stranded. Over half the dams in our reference class had cost overruns so large that even if their original benefit forecast was met, these dams would still be stranded. They would never pay back. So I take the point that benefits do need to be counted, except that the cost overruns alone are so large, coupled with scheduled delays, that the value of those benefits is far lower than people anticipated. So you might ask, why do these things happen? And our argument is twofold, and we call it delusion and deception, politely, or fools and liars, less politely. there's a tremendous amount of optimism about costs and benefits upfront that causes people to do things both big and small. In the case of dams, the problems involved are so large that optimism bias becomes particularly problematic. The second problem is lying. People strategically misrepresent the budgets and underestimate the true costs. There could be financial gain, but also there's huge amounts of money at stake. Typical project costs of a large dam runs to about $2 billion. There's a lot of money to be made in these big projects. So, large dams are not worth the cost. We need alternatives. There are places we can look. Norway is a very good example. It doesn't build very many dams, but it produces 99% of its electricity from hydropower. So our next project is to really assess what is it that Norway is doing, and some countries like Portugal and Spain have replicated some of that do not require construction of large dams, but can still use the naturally available water and provide the hydropower, but also storage required. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm afraid I work in hydropower, which makes me either a liar or something else. So my apologies for producing my lies for you this afternoon. I'd like to talk to you a bit about delay. And we have heard that projects get delayed. We could debate the extent, but projects do get delayed. But quite surprisingly, very little has been written about the extent to which projects get delayed and the impacts, which can be quite devastating. But they can be devastating on a country which actually needed that dam. It was required. The economic decision to build it was important. If we look at the Bujagali project in Uganda, by my calculations, it cost Uganda 1% of GDP per year that the project wasn't delivered. 1% of GDP. If we could have stood in Uganda during that time that project was delayed, this was before it was constructed, this is just while they were trying to get organized to get it constructed. If we could have stood there and said, actually, instead of making this take 7 years, I can make it take 6, you could have saved Uganda 1% of GDP. 1% of GDP that it cost them to keep the lights on for the 6% of the population that had access to electricity. They needed that dam. The first attempt to build it was made by a company which eventually withdrew from the project. When they withdrew, they wrote off $75 million. And there was very little to show for it. If you had $75 million to spend in Uganda today, what could you do with it? An awful lot more than waste it trying to prepare a project and failing. During that time, the people who needed to be moved for the dam were moved under the first developer. The developer then withdrew. The people had been moved, but they hadn't been provided with the kind of income restoration activities which were planned for the project. So they moved house, they no longer had access to the river, but they didn't have the income generating opportunities. They lived in limbo. They lived in no man's land for 5 years while they waited for this project to happen. And all of this was done in the pursuit of a better dam, that we would do it better. Did we do it better? Yes, it's been done now. But in 2002, President Museveni went there to lay the inauguration stone of the project, basically to break ground on the project in 2002 with the first developer. And this was what he said: "I'm ashamed to even come here. I'm not happy because the project, which should have taken 2 years to start, has taken 7. It's all hullabaloo." After he said this, the project took a further 5 years to start. And during that time, the economic benefits of the project were delayed. They weren't delayed during problems during construction that we were just hearing about. They were delayed because the project didn't start. So we've heard a bit about the likely increases in cost. My research showed that if a project is delayed from being started, then it's more likely to encounter cost overruns. Now, there's two ways you can spin that. You can say, well, that's because during the time, extra time you spent thinking about this project before you started it, you envisaged a lot of things that would have been unforeseen when you built it, and therefore some of the costs which would have appeared as unknown costs are actually now known costs. That would be a really good spin on the idea that they cost more. Or, alternatively, they cost more because your project has a reputation for delay, and every contractor who puts in a bid puts in a risk premium for delay. But if you look at the question of delay, on one axis you have pre-construction delay, on the vertical axis you've got construction delay. You would think that projects that spend longer in pre-construction, that think harder about how to build a dam, would be more effective at building it. But they're not. There is a positive correlation between pre-construction and construction delay. The longer you spend thinking about it, the longer it takes you to do it. We typically underestimate the benefits of dams. And I'm also an economist, so I'm guilty of this. You work out the benefits of dams, and particularly when you take in all the multi-purpose benefits David spoke about, you find that the benefits are significant. But a lot of them are quite difficult to cost. They're quite difficult to value. So you take the ones you can value, which are typically the hydropower benefits, and you say, okay, if we only did this dam for hydropower, we would have an economic rate of return of 20%, 12%, whatever it is. Most countries have a bar for an economic rate of return, which is 10%-ish. We can demonstrate 20. We don't need to cost the rest of the benefits. So we list it as a 20% rate of return plus unquantified benefits. And I would say the biggest problem with the data that we look at is the benefits are hugely underestimated in just about every document that we present, because of those unquantified benefits, which years later, when somebody's looking for a figure to go with a project, they never think about that little tail to the words. But the biggest problem is that we don't understand the way projects develop and the impact they have. This is a World Bank report. Forgive me, I used to work for them. The impact of delays on construction on economic returns depend on when that delay occurs. If it occurs before construction begins, there is no impact. No, sorry. If you're expecting an economic return out of a project and you don't build it, you don't get the economic return. That is an impact. If you look at some of the economic returns, the Bumbuna project in Sierra Leone, it had an economic rate of return of 42%. If that project were to experience a 2-year delay, the study which was done before the project stated, that economic rate of return fell to 28%, from 42 down to 28. But the report said helpfully afterwards, that's still a very healthy rate of return. Well, that's all right then. So, my request, this is not a call for rushed preparation. This is not a call for dashing into dams without looking at where we're going. But it is a call for getting it right, first time, on time, knowing what we're doing. Don't repeat studies. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. We have to act to manage and mitigate risk. Don't just let it happen. Don't just assure ourselves that all projects are delayed, so we'll just live with it. Be honest with the stakeholders. If you're going to move people in 1 year's time, tell them that's the case. If they're going to sit for 10 years' time and wait, then tell them that's the case too. As international agencies, we need to spend more time improving the capacity to manage projects, to understand the cost of doing it late, and to get on with it. Thank you.
afternoon, everybody. Rob has asked me to speak this afternoon a little bit about impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. And even though that's not my main focus of interest in West Africa on the Niger River where I work, I've put together a couple of things based broadly around current proxy indicators that we might be able to find that would help us understand this issue. And I'm not really going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions. If you want to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we can talk about that during the panel session. But that is a broader, sort of global impact that is very relevant to hydropower currently. What do we know about impacts? There isn't an awful lot of data around that we can use, but the IUCN Red List has a very useful status on what we know. And according to that list, 21% of African freshwater species are currently threatened. If we look at where those threats are happening, this is the map from their recent report. It does show the species per country, so the darker the countries, the sort of Congo, Eastern Africa, and so on, are much more, have many more species threatened than elsewhere. But note the scale of this. We have, in the darkest countries, the most threatened areas are between 89 and 325 species. And in the lighter countries, 1 to 7 or up to 21. If we then look at, and unfortunately they don't do this by country, it's much more micro level. If we then look at the number of species that are threatened by infrastructure, and these are all the 5 groups, the 5 taxonomic groups threatened by infrastructure development, we find that the most threatened parts of Africa are dealing with 11 to 13 species. Mostly in Nigeria and in Guinea or Sierra Leone, which suggests that at that sort of macro level of threats to species in Africa, threats to freshwater species in Africa, infrastructure doesn't rate right at the top of the agenda. Another way of looking at this might be to take the site-based approach, and within this we can look at the Ramsar Convention, which is the international convention that lists sites of international wetland importance. And this is the distribution of Ramsar sites in Africa. Now, these sites are declared by government according to a set of criteria, so they probably don't reflect all of the important sites, but they're the ones that government have put forward for international recognition. Within the Ramsar Convention, there is also a list of sites that are threatened by changes to their ecological character, and that's the Montreux record of threatened internationally important sites, of which there are 8 in Africa, and 6 of those are due to changing land use or pollution, and 2 of them are due to infrastructure, large dams. So at a sort of initial scan of what can we say at the continental level, it doesn't look at present as though dams are a major threat to biodiversity. What a lot of people who are interested in ecosystems have done, though, is to take a more broad view about ecosystem services, and particularly ecosystem services for people. And this is an example from the Inner Niger Delta in Mali, which was undertaken by Associates of Wetlands International. And they compare the costs and benefits of wetland services for people with the Selengue Dam, the Office du Niger Dam, and the planned Fomi Dam in Guinea. And they look at the value for agricultural production, livestock, fisheries, biodiversity, transport, and electricity. And you can see that, as I think we'll find when we come to discuss this in more detail in the panel, it very much depends on the siting of your dam, on the size of your dam, in order to calculate its impacts. And these 3 dams are on the same river, and yet the monetary value of their impacts is significantly different. One can argue about the way in which this is done, but it illustrates for me that the main thrust of nature conservation, if you like, the arguments are very much being made in terms of value to people, support for local development, support for agriculture and livestock, and the biodiversity values as such are just one of many ecosystem services that are provided at the local level. This indicates, I think, a broader sense that it is use of water and the benefits that water generates that is important for people and for governments, and it's much less significant the pure biodiversity or nature conservation aspect of things, as poverty is so widespread. So when we look at future prospects and we ask who is going to stand up for this biodiversity, or who's going to stand up and say that species should be maintained, I think we can say that we've probably only got 6%. David's slide said 8, probably 6, 8, 9, less than 10% anyway of African hydropower developed. We don't have very good data on biodiversity distribution, nor its responsiveness to different flow levels. So it's very challenging to actually say if you allow this much water to flow, you will end up with this much biodiversity. We can also say that ministries of environment have very little political clout, that indigenous NGOs are very weak. There isn't a nature conservation NGO lobby in many of the countries that I work in. And the trade-offs are very much in favor of development. Where dams are financed by donors like China, there are very few, if any, environmental safeguards that are applied to dams, and China is a major funder of dams in Africa. And currently there is much more traction to be had discussing ecosystem services and promoting those services as of value to people than there is in defending biodiversity in the pure sense. Interestingly though, if one asks the question who is currently advocating for ecosystem sustainability, the answer is a rather unexpected quarter. It's the World Bank in the countries that I work in. And the reason for that is because of the strong Western donor government requirement for environmental sustainability, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the local development priorities in the countries in which we work. So the operational safeguards of the World Bank and the African Development Bank are much more stringent and much more demanding than the levels that most governments in West Africa would do if they were left to their own devices. An interesting conundrum, how are we going to justify ecosystem maintenance through national government priorities or through donor requirements? And that has led a number of governments to regard the World Bank really as a donor of last resort because the conditionalities are so intense. And if China's prepared to pay for the dam, then they'll probably take that option before they take the World Bank. Thank you.
Before coming to this particular case of Ethiopia's Gibe 3 dam, I just want to make mention what you might call some killer facts about people who are displaced by development projects, not just dams. In fact, roads are the biggest cause of displacement when it comes to development. First of all, there's a great many of them. The figure usually quoted is 50 million annually per year. Secondly, they generally tend to be worse off as a result of being displaced than they were before. And thirdly, they tend to come from sections of the society which are relatively disadvantaged already, very often ethnic minorities. So if dams are necessary for economic growth, as they surely are, especially in developing and late industrializing countries, and if development is going to be inclusive, then obviously dams must be made into development opportunities for the people who have to get out of the way to make them possible. The good news is that we know how to do this. There's been over 50 years of research on development-caused displacement, and this research has come to certain conclusions, some of which, the ones that are relevant to this discussion, could be summarized under three headings. There needs to be open and transparent information sharing from the very start of project planning. There needs to be consultation which is meaningful in the sense that those consulted have to feel that their input will affect the outcome, and there need to be specific, deliberate, targeted schemes for compensation, benefit sharing, and livelihood reconstruction. The bad news is that these principles are as widely accepted in theory as they are ignored in practice, with some notable exceptions. The one I'm going to discuss here must be about probably I'm not a dams person, as it were. I'm an anthropologist who has worked in a particular part of Ethiopia, but I suspect this dam must be one of the most extreme examples one could find of how not to do river basin development. Gibe 3 dam is currently under construction. It won't be fully operational until 2017. It's 5 years behind schedule. Its main social and environmental impacts are to be felt down in the lower, where are we now? Yes, in the lower basin of the Omo. The dam will eliminate the annual flood, and therefore it will, which getting on for 100,000 people in the lower basin depend on for flood cultivation. Here's some flood cultivation along the Omo of sorghum. Here's some more on a river island. People also keep cattle and cultivate and use rain-fed cultivation as well in the Omo bush and forest, which you can see at the back of this in the distance in this photograph. So one, it'll eliminate the flood that these people depend on. Secondly, it will make possible, of course, large-scale commercial irrigation schemes in the lower Omo, which will in fact become, if all goes to plan, the biggest irrigation complex in Ethiopia, bigger than the entire irrigated area of Kenya. Here we see in the light-shaded, yellow-shaded area, sugar plantations organized by the Ethiopian Sugar Corporation, which will cover 175,000 hectares. Irrigation on this scale, this is the third point about impact, irrigation on this scale will, there by the way is an image of what's been done so far, a satellite image from a few months ago. Irrigation on this scale will result in a permanent fall in Lake Turkana, the world's largest desert lake, of at least 20 meters. The lake is 30 meters deep on average. This will affect about 300,000 people who live around Lake Turkana. Now we don't, as for the people of the lower Omo, I think that'll do. As for the people of the lower Omo, they will, according to the government's plans, move into resettlement villages along irrigation canals, give up their herds, take up irrigated agriculture, and provide seasonal labor in the sugar plantations. This will make them, in the government's view, quote, genuine beneficiaries of development. We don't need to look into a crystal ball to have serious doubts about this prediction. We only need to ask whether the lessons learnt from past projects and summed up in the 3 principles I mentioned earlier have been incorporated into the planning and management of this one. The answer, unfortunately, is a resounding no. There isn't time to go into this in more detail now, but I very happily do so later, go into the reasons why the answer is no. We can make an evidence-based prediction that the majority of those affected by this project will be impoverished by it in the name of development. It will become, in the words of Michael Chernier, the chief architect of the World Bank's resettlement guidelines, and I quote, another disgracing stain on development itself. Is there time to do anything about this? Yes, because the dam, as I said, is behind schedule. It'll be 2017 before it's completely operational. The irrigation development is only just starting. So what should be done? Further hydrological, ecological, socio-economic studies should be undertaken, as have been strongly advised by various independent reviews of the project, by the French consultancy firm Sogria, by a colleague, Sean Avery, based in Nairobi, who is probably done more than anyone else to draw attention to the impact of irrigation in the lower Omo on Lake Turkana. These reviews have shown that there are really important gaps in the environmental impact assessment which should be filled. Secondly, all existing assessments and feasibility studies for irrigation development in the Omo should be released for public discussion. Believe it or not, there are no impact assessments or feasibility studies available for that huge sugar project in the lower Omo. And thirdly, adequately funded schemes for compensation, benefit sharing, livelihood reconstruction should clearly be implemented. And in all of this, the affected people should take the lead in arriving at solutions with government and donors providing help. Now, will this happen? The honest answer must be it's unlikely, but we must obviously hope for the best. I'd like to end with just, if I've got time, 1 minute, a quote from an article a couple of years ago in the Brooklyn Journal of International Law on property insecurity in economic development by Tara Lawson-Remmer. She points out that, quote, economic development has often involved the expropriation of land and resources from groups that are marginalized culturally, racially, ethnically, or socio-economically, and the reallocation of these resources into the hands of politically powerful constituencies. She goes on, the last sentence or paragraph of the article, one implication is clear: aggregate economic growth does not necessarily mean inclusive economic development. Those with the least power and voice may be left out and left behind by growth-enhancing policies that strengthen the property rights of those with access to capital and political influence by weakening the property rights of marginalized groups. This suggests that a narrow focus on aggregate economic growth without specific attention to political and economic inclusion can exacerbate poverty and socio-economic exclusion and hurt the most vulnerable. I would emphasize those words, without specific attention to political and economic inclusion, because I think it's those words that are highlighted and brought to our attention by the literature on development caused displacement. Thank you very much.
Right, at this stage, I'd like to invite our speakers to come up for the panel discussion. Because, like some dam projects, there's been a slight overrun on timings, I think we're going to move straight into questions. And I'm going to ask, there should be a microphone at the back of the room and one near the front. So if you want to raise your hand for a question, and can you please have a question, please? We don't want an anecdote of when you were in Egypt in the 1950s. We want a short question so we can try and have as many as possible from the room. Have a lady there. And if the panelists will take a batch of questions and then we'll distribute them amongst you. Yes, please.
I have a question about, because some of the projects in Africa are funded by the Chinese government, and they're arguing that they're following a non-intervention principle, which means that they won't ask too much about their income dispense of all the benefits, which is probably coming from the future schemes. So my question is, what do you think of this non-intervention principle of the Chinese government when they're doing the fundings?
Okay, thank you. Liz, at the front, and then at the back.
Hello, thank you. Maybe just a quick question. Corruption, any general estimates or thoughts on the extent to which corruption impacts on the time and on the cost from a percentage point of view?
Okay, thank you. The lady at the back.
Mine is not a question, but basically to mention that most of the benefits of huge infrastructure do not go to Africa and do not go to the poor. Most of African people live in the raw areas where there's no grid systems. And so most of the hydropower generated from large dams transmitted by huge grid systems does not go to the majority of Africans. Most of the water abstracted for irrigation goes to large sugar estates, not basic food production.
Okay, thank you. I think we can invert that and say it's a benefit sharing question. Gentleman here.
Mike Edmonds from Geography. We've heard a lot about large dams, and I think one or two allusions to small dams. And we've heard a lot about damage for people being uprooted and so on. I just want to hear the panel's views on the construction of smaller check dams across larger areas of the terrain where people actually live and are not displaced. And these are often at quite low cost. And I just wonder how the panel view this in terms of the very large infrastructure that most people have been talking about.
Okay, well maybe we'll stop there. So we have 4 questions very broadly about China and non-conditionality, about corruption, benefit sharing, and then Mike's question in terms of smaller dams. If I can ask the panelists to tackle one of those questions, just very briefly. And David, would you like to start?
Sure. There's a fundamental problem in the literature, there's a fundamental problem in all of our minds, and that is that we don't look at benefits. It's anecdotal. We have, give me a journal article that speaks about the benefits from these structures. We also don't look back at the past in our own countries. And I think that's important too. Give me some articles on the damages, the long-run benefits and costs in Europe. I mean, the German draining of the Prussian marshes and the ethnic cleansing of people out of the Prussian marshes. The rise of National Socialism in that part of Germany as a consequence. So we have stories to tell, which will be much more powerful when we speak to people in Africa and say, be careful, be careful. The China, I know quite a lot about what China is doing in Africa. I traveled with a group of Chinese officials and academics a few months ago to several countries specifically about Chinese finance. And the Chinese notion of non-interference is it's a willing seller, willing buyer. We don't interfere in government policies. I led the water practice of the World Bank for a number of years. And the World Bank requirements on governments in Africa are greater than any requirement that has ever been met by a rich country in its path to growth. So we demand of the poorest countries in the world the highest standards. There's a hypocrisy in that's a problem. And my own belief is that should we demand high standards? Yes, we should. But who should pay for them? And I've got some very good examples in my head, which I haven't got time to speak about, but where we have pressured African governments to meet extremely high costs of ecosystem damage from the construction of dams. In case, look it up on the web. It's called the Kahansi spray toad. Okay. So the survival of some toads that you cannot see, they're invisible. And the unit cost per toad was higher than the cost of health and education for a child. So that's what was enforced by the World Bank on a government in Africa, in Tanzania in that case.
David, thank you. Atif, would you like to take one of those questions?
If I may address all 4, sort of touch on them. I'd begin with the story of Thea Scudder, who is a social writer about social impacts of dams. And for the longest time, he's supported dams, and he claims that every single time he did a dam and it went wrong from a social perspective, cost perspective, ecological perspective, he'd say, well, this case may have been an exception, the next one will be better. And he is, quite old now, and he said that day never arrived. And after my colleagues and I published our paper this March, he sent us an email saying, I have finally changed my mind. Dams are not worth the cost, financially, environmentally, ecologically, socially. And the reason for that, and New York Times published published an article about Thea Scudder about our study. And I think let's not kid ourselves. There are a lot of anecdotes about the supposed magical benefits of dams, but these costs that are across all those dimensions are consistently, systematically understated and sometimes dire. Particularly on the social ecological side, it's catastrophic, as one paper in Proceedings of National American Societies put in the case of Mekong.
So let's look at large databases. I thoroughly support the idea of collecting a very large data set on benefits. In fact, we are working on them. But it's very difficult to find these data, which is an indication of obfuscation that people very deliberately do to hide them. If the benefits were there to be observed, we would have observed them. I'd like to further suggest on the smaller dams, dams are quite a blunt, despite the amount of engineering that goes into them, quite a blunt technology of production. It's basically just stopping the flow of a very sophisticated river. I think we're far advanced in human progress where we need to think of something more subtle that works with the earth, not against it.
Okay, Atif, thank you. Judith, would you like to respond?
Let me just touch on the point about small dams. I think we have to be quite careful to make sure that we're applying the same standards to small dams that we apply to large dams. I fully agree that there are places where small dams can be very useful, but there is a tendency just to believe that in and of their nature, small dams are not damaging and large dams are damaging. And a very good colleague of mine used to say that there are not small dams good, large dams bad, but you can actually have bad small dams and good large dams. And particularly because in order to create the same amount of storage, you need an awful lot more small dams. You can add up to a larger environmental impact than one large dam. That doesn't necessarily say that it's not a good idea to explore. As David said earlier, all of these options need exploring to as much as they can possibly do to aid development. But just that we have to consider the rights and wrongs of every approach very carefully.
Thank you. David, would you like to take one of those questions?
I'd just like to underline the point made by the lady at the back about irrigation, water for irrigation being used for example, sugar rather than for food crops, or even in the case of the dam or the irrigation scheme I was talking about, for export rather than for local consumption. One can see the attraction of that from the point of view of the government and economic growth figures, but one can question perhaps whether it's in the interests of, whether it is actually in the interest of poverty reduction in areas such as the one I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. Michael?
Yes, so I'll try and pick up on a couple of the questions. First of all, the question about the extent of corruption in time and cost on large dams. I'm not aware of any data, but I think that there are some celebrated cases of really large-scale corruption on a number of these famous projects. And you only have to go and Google Lesotho Highlands, for example, or the Itaipu project in South America. They are magnets for corruption because of the intensity of capital investment that goes on. But I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any data. I'll move to safer ground, if I might. Smaller dams, and if I can just widen the answer, that I think that the challenge is storing water. I think that if we accept that in general it's easier to store water than it is to transfer it long distances, our challenge, as Atif has indicated, is to think of more imaginative ways of storing that water. Smaller check dams, and I'm sorry I didn't mention those in my earlier presentation, I think are a good technology because they're simple to construct and don't necessarily involve the involvement of large international construction companies. Similarly with recharge dams for recharging aquifers. Now that's combining, if you like, dam technology with technology to mobilize the storage within aquifers. I think that these are technologies which do need perhaps more thought, but do offer the potential. Having said all of that, I think that we will see, Atif like it or not, the construction of many, many more large dams with greater than 15 metres of height. And I think that our challenge as advisors in this field is to ensure that they are properly investigated before they start, both in terms of their costs and benefits. So smaller dams, yes, please.
Jamie.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on the view around China and its non-intervention policy. I mean, certainly I think that it's important for donors to respect what national governments want to do. Sorry, is this not working? I think it's important for donors to respect the policies of national governments. But I also think that, as has been raised by a number of others, that the ability to learn across projects and to do things better only comes by having core groups of people that understand what has worked and what hasn't worked elsewhere. So I work in Niger, it's building its first dam. It probably won't build more than one other in the next 20 years. Where is the learning that Niger is going to have in terms of what its choices are and what its opportunities are? Guinea is currently building 4 dams, but luckily there are donors that are involved in all those dams, so there is the possibility to actually build national capacity and to try and have some form of learning, because I think what we're all trying to do is to shift good practice in the right direction, to say this technology has the ability to bring significant benefits. So how do we go about doing it in such a way that we manage to avoid the downsides? And there are 2 ways of doing that to my mind. One is if we have collective learning, but the most important one, and that kind of speaks to the large versus small dams, is to choose good sites. One of the problems in the countries I work in is that there aren't any good sites. Every single site has got 30,000 or 40,000 people living there. So the idea of finding a lovely big hydropower site where nobody's living just doesn't exist. Now, a number of other countries have had that opportunity and have seized it. But I think if we look in detail about why Hoover Dam and why not Kandaji Dam or Fomi Dam in Guinea, they didn't have to shift 50,000 people at Hoover. You know? So they had a site there which is extremely an excellent hydropower site. And I don't think the countries that I work in have those sites.
Okay, can we open it up for some more questions, please? One at the front here, and then maybe one at the back.
Okay, quick question, primarily for Mr. Norton. My question focuses on the role of the consultants or the dam engineers from an ethical standpoint, and what role do they play in terms of deciding go or no go? And in particular, several of the examples we've seen in Africa, and some of our colleagues, and I used to work for AMEC actually in the past, but other firms constructing large dams with the lack of environmental impact statement, social impact statement, and a lack of transparency. What sort of ethic would you suggest amongst the consulting firms?
Okay, thank you. One at the back.
Hi, I think my question's more for Atif. You're saying that dams aren't really the way forward and we need to start looking at alternative options. So kind of could you expand a little bit more on what those alternative options could be? Because I can see for hydro energy, you can kind of look more to solar and things like that to get forms of energy, but how do you deal with what David was saying at the beginning about water insecurity and food insecurity as well? I just wanted you to expand on that.
Okay, lady 2 up here. Yep.
Thank you. I work on cultural mitigation, head of dams in Lesotho, and we're always told that our work contributes primarily to the potential for tourism development. And I was wondering if the panel could speak at all to how much dam projects actually do lead to potential tourism development, whether that accrues any benefits whatsoever in sort of the win column. As we've been hearing, we need to talk more about benefits anyway.
Okay. Is there another lady down the line there? Do you have your hand up? Yes?
Okay, well, small dams normally are contained within the boundaries of one
Can we have a question, if it's possible, please?
What is the importance of the fact that big dams can have enormous international implications? For example, the case of David Turton, where it's a closed lake, Turkana, in Kenya. 300,000 people. The lake is to go down by 20 meters, I think he said. All the dams are sort of coming out of Ethiopia. I mean, there's a new one on the Blue Nile. It will affect all the countries downstream. from the Ethiopian border.
Okay.
Is the international aspect of things going to be more destructive in the future, potentially?
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question over here.
Taking up the point about learning and transferring experience, my question is, do we need a good dams guide? And if so, which dams would the panelists place at the top of such a guide?
Okay, great question. Gentleman just here.
Thank you. Guy Jobbins from the Overseas Development Institute. Just a very quick question. We haven't mentioned climate change so much today. Are not large dams locking in different kinds of vulnerability to future climate change? And what needs to be done to improve resilience to future climate changes?
Okay, maybe we'll just pause there and we will come back to some questions to the panelists. If you could be brief in your answers, then we can get more questions. David, would you like to start?
Let me pick up the international story. There's some good examples and some bad ones. And a good example of a good dam, I would argue, is Manantali, which is 300 kilometers inside Mali. It's co-owned by Senegal, Mali, and Mauritania. They worked out the benefits that they wanted. They have a key of costs and benefits. Mali is landlocked. It wanted navigation. Mauritania wanted flood recession agriculture. Senegal wanted a pipeline. They've been operating this through a joint institution for the last 25 years. They recently had a new treaty around environmental flows. They're getting better at it. They do this without donors. There were no donors involved. There were 3 financiers of the structure, but most of the debt is paid off. So and that's international. So there are some really good examples. Arguably South Africa and the Lesotho Highlands scheme with Lesotho. The Kariba is another good example. Someone spoke about biodiversity. My understanding from what I've read is that the greatly improved biodiversity at Kariba, which is on the border of Zambia and Zimbabwe, but terrible resettlement problems with I think it's the Tonga tribe, who are still living in camps 30 years on, and there's no excuse for that. So the question of costs and benefits are terribly important, and where I would argue with Atif is that in his paper I didn't see anything about benefits, and many of the dams that I read about, and the paper is about 1% of the world's large dams, so it's very hard, I think, to draw conclusions from 1% that are carefully selected. And I know many of the referees, including Ted Scudder and Patrick McCulley and so on, and there's a strong activist strain in there. So if activists refer to activists, you can get into trouble. And I'm looking forward to continuing this debate with Atif as we move forward and look at benefits, because I think it's terribly important we tell a story. I'm not an apologist for dams. Dams bring terrible problems, but we don't right now have a solution. And are the 26,000 odd that have been built in rich parts of the world, all of them wrong? Should we take them down? What did we do why did we build them? And what did we do wrong and what did we do right? And that's a story that we need to be able to tell.
Okay. Atif, if you could respond to the questions, that would be great. Thank you.
So alternatives, it's something we're considering and looking into at the moment. What Norway does, which is quite interesting, it takes advantage of natural differences in topography and just builds a penstock without damming at all. So with the stream flowing up, you take advantage of the natural head and you stick a bunch of turbines in the middle, the water flows away. It's environmentally very subtle. It produces a lot of electricity. 99% of the country is wired with hydropower. But they do have their own large dams as well, and some of them quite problematic as well. Now, the other schemes to consider, Thames Barrier, for example, is essentially a levee, but doesn't use a permanent barrier. It's a barrier that goes up and down. It's designed like a gas valve. So only when the flood needs to come in, it goes up. Otherwise, it goes back down. So I'm not against harnessing hydropower, but these permanent dams clearly have unpredictable and vast consequences. They're very bespoke. It's very much like 1950s shipping. It was all done manually by hand. So what the container did by modularity to break bulk cargo, we need an alternative like that and modularize it. So that's on alternatives. But it's a research stream. So if you drop me an email, I'll keep you posted on what else we find as we go along. Regarding learning, a guide alone wouldn't do it.
First of all, there isn't enough experience. As I said, data, despite David's insistence, are really hard to come by. So we did not cherry pick data. All data that was valid and reliable that we could include in our study, we included. And we are happy to be challenged on that and happy to collaborate to collect further data. Whereas often these things are told in terms of anecdotes. So just a guidebook is not going to do it. These projects are simply too vast and simply too complex to be resolved by that. Maybe some kind of a knowledge management center. So the Olympics has tried that. Every Olympics have got the notorious honor of being the one asset class that has had a 10 out of 10 Olympics ever considered have had an overrun, and substantial ones. So the Olympics are really bad, even worse than dams. And there, they've recognized that, and they've created a knowledge management unit. And essentially, repeat teams can do these things better. So you create an independent group of consultants that literally fly from an Olympic to Olympic, or fly from a dam to dam, and you pay them enough money that they're not corrupted by the incentives that these very large dollar schemes bring in. Role of consultants is, to be honest, whatever little work we've done, really suspect here. In fact, most of the lying may be done by consultants. So promoters may want to get certain schemes done, and they on record tell you this anonymously, that they underestimate the true costs, the true environmental impacts. They've got jobs, you can kind of understand, they've got kids to look after as well. But the role, I would be very suspicious of consultants, and hence I'm an academic.
Atif, I think we'll, just in the interest of time, Judith, would you like to make a comment?
Thank you. On the tourism point, I think there are good examples. There's particularly the new skills which can come, which can often employ the local people in things like fisheries. I mean, providing fishing as a tourist opportunity can be quite significant from large dams. And tourism, I think, is another thing for which you need a strategy before it starts in order to make the best use of it. But there are good examples, and don't stop. On climate change, if I can just say, there's a very interesting study which you can find done by Mark Jurland and Dale Whittington, which looks at if you had the opportunity and you did a real options analysis of either building a project now with flexibility in design to deal with whatever changes climate change might bring, or you waited 5 years to hope you would have better data on what your hydrological flows might actually be, that in just about every scenario they could possibly develop, it was better to build it now with flexibility rather than to try to wait for certainty, because the variations were so significant that it takes a very long time. You have to wait an awful lot longer than 5 years to have certainty as what your hydrological flows will be. So I'd refer you to that. The other thing on learning, there is the International Hydropower Sustainability Protocol. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but it's a very good centre for learning around hydropower development and large dams, and it also collects examples of best practice. So it's a really good place to start on learning.
Judith, thank you. David?
Yes, just a quick word about the international aspect in relation to the Gibe 3 project and the irrigation. It took a long time to actually get either government, Ethiopia or Kenya, to accept the fact that there was going to be a big permanent reduction in the level of Lake Turkana, because somehow or other the irrigation was regarded as something separate from the dam, even though it's made possible by the dam. I think this is a standard phenomenon as well in the dam business, that you or for those who are, or the dam builders, you don't want to consider basin-wide impacts, indirect impacts. Anyway, that was the case as far as Gibe 3 is concerned, which is the only dam I know about. It's a bit of a mystery why there wasn't or hasn't been more of a protest, if you like, coming from Kenya. There could be lots of reasons which there aren't time to go into. But just one point to make, I would like to make, is that the estimate of a 20-metre drop in level, and of course it isn't just a drop in level, by the way, and that's at issue. It's the hydrology of the lake, the impact on fishes and so on. But just considering the drop in level, the prediction of a 20-meter drop is based upon an assumption of a 60% irrigation efficiency for those irrigation schemes. Now, Avery would, I'm sure, now agree that that's pretty optimistic. And it may be more like 40%, which I understand is the rule of thumb figure used for irrigation in Kenya. That could mean would mean a bigger drop than 20 meters. If it goes down to 30 meters or 40 meters, then the lake becomes two puddles. The southern puddle will have very little water coming into it, so that will disappear. I mean, we are talking about the potential near disappearance of the world's largest desert lake. That is not the concern so much I would have as how are the people who live around that lake going to be, as it were, catered for, and in what way, if at all, is this going to become a development opportunity for them rather than the opposite?
David, thank you. Michael.
Okay, so I'm going to tackle two questions. First, the one that was directly to me about the role of consultants. Atif, of course, is absolutely right. The role of consultants is to be honest. And I must say his inference that most of us are dishonest rather worries me. But the honesty, I think, has got to be displayed in two ways. One is that consultants are honest to their clients when it comes to what are the costs of construction of large dams, but more importantly, where are the risks to that cost going up or down, and being very clear about where they are and what impact they could have. The second area of honesty and integrity, I think, is when consultants are asked to adjudicate, or rather evaluate, the bids of construction companies. And here, the way in which the evaluation criteria are built and used should be operated by the consultant totally transparently. And I would say that I believe that happens pretty much 99% of the times. Unfortunately, sometimes some client organizations will ignore the assessment of their consultant, and this is a fact. So moving on, learning. Peter, the example I'm going to give you is one from California. The O'Shaughnessy Dam has been supplying San Francisco with drinking water for 100 years and generating 400 megawatts of electricity at the same time. It was constructed after the earthquake in California in the early 1900s, and such was its success. It was heightened in the 1930s to provide more water and power. The interesting thing about this dam, Peter, is that in 2013, it was subjected to a public ballot in California of a lobby group that asked for the dam to be torn down so that the 7 miles of the Yosemite Valley could be restored to its original position. 4 out of 5 Californians voted to hold on to the dam, which was an interesting test in their thought about its worth to the city.
Great, thank you. Jamie?
Thank you. Just a word about consultants. Consultants play, in West Africa at any rate, a disproportionate role, in my view, in decision making. And they take over the role of government by making recommendations in voluminous reports that are very, very hard for local teams to actually take ownership of, and to take the models and to take the economic assessments and the spreadsheets and the calculations and so on, and actually use that data to say, well, what else could we do with this water resource that we have? There's a package that arrives in a 1,000-page report, and it's basically put on the table in intergovernmental, interministerial meetings and transboundary meetings, and it's take it or leave it. You either endorse it and you take it, or you don't take it. But the margin for countries with very little capacity and river-basin organizations with very little capacity to actually crunch the numbers themselves and say, well, I don't agree with what they're telling me, I'm going to take my own view, is extremely limited. So the role of the consultant is absolutely critical in that part of the world. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing I think is that consultants are probably very like dams. They're all different. I probably one of the few people that have read all the feasibility studies and all the environmental assessments of 5 different dams in West Africa, and you can see the differences, and you can see the cut and paste. It's the same table from the same consultant. And you can see the lunacy as well, in the sense of consultants saying, oh, what's going to happen? Well, the grazing is going to disappear, okay? So how do we compensate for loss of grazing? Oh, we'll buy hay. We're going to buy hay for 30,000 cattle. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's stick it in the plan. But it's just not realistic. You just cannot buy hay for 30,000 cows. It's just not going to happen. So you get this kind of lunatic thing of, what's the impact, what's the response in a big matrix, without any real sense of how functional and appropriate that response might be. So that, again, that's anecdotal, and there are probably 100 other anecdotes of excellent consultants say, well, I wouldn't do it this way, I'd do it that way. So there's all sorts out there. And I think one of the really serious things that's happening is that governments that I work with are increasingly taking the lowest cost consultant, and they're producing bad work. And they're building infrastructure based on bad advice because it's the lowest cost advice that they can get. And if there's one thing that is really going against the whole learning thing that we've been talking about, it's that trend. It wastes time, it doesn't answer the questions, and it doesn't provide a good foundation for local development. And I think that if that continues, then the prospects are pretty grim. We're looking basically at the next 5 years of cut and paste.
Okay, on that very cheerful note, I think we're coming to a conclusion. I'd like to give the panelists one word, literally 30 seconds, just to summarize a viewpoint in terms of how we may make these trade-offs better in the future, and then we have to conclude because we run out of time with the room. So David, if you can try and contain it to 30 seconds, just one word.
So, my key message is that Africa, more than any other continent on this planet, must mitigate variability and must do it through storage of one form or another. And that there is a risk that Western activism, Western standards, Western norms, Western costs are stalling this, slowing it down, and this will result in major problems. It'll result in large-scale movements of people, in my view. I think we're already seeing it, by the way. We see several million people on the north coast of Africa as we speak, and it could be tens, it could even be hundreds of millions. So let's get with it and understand that this is inevitable, and let's help to do it well.
Thank you. Steve?
I'd suggest let's not collectively make foolish decisions. The entire financial industry for years was locked into really terrible rules of thumb about how to make loans, mortgages, very easy, very simple, and they couldn't get it right, and the mess that created. These are far bigger investments. We can't trust people who are generally less paid than bankers to make these on our behalf. Certainly, we do need to think of alternatives, things that are subtle, and as I said, work with the earth rather than against it. Thank you.
Judith?
I agree with David that I think we need to do this, we need to do it well, and we need to do it right. And one of the best ways that we can ensure that that happens is to improve the capacity on the ground. The governments in the countries that we're trying to help need the capacity to make better decisions and to do things like select the right consultants to advise them. Consultants who I do believe give very good advice. But you certainly in consulting get what you pay for. So the kind of capacity that you need to regulate different companies coming into the country to build dams is really significant. And that's one way that we could help ensure that dams are built better.
Thank you, David.
And I would simply say that doing it right and doing it well must include doing it in a way that makes the people who are bearing the main cost of this exercise be amongst the first beneficiaries, or be the first beneficiaries. The costs at the moment, it seems, are being, externalized, not counted in the actual cost-benefit analysis that justifies the dam. The costs are being borne by very often extremely vulnerable and marginalized people. And Dorothy Roy, talking about the Narmada Dam and the people displaced from that point, and this brings in consultants again, I'm afraid, or at least the dam industry, that the fact that the people affected were I think in the case of Narmada, those who were forced to move, were 50% of them belong to what is known as the tribal populations, which account for only 8% of the total Indian population. So it's disproportionately vulnerable politically and economically people. And as the way Roy put it was that this, in a way, this suits the dam builders because they can, it's like having an expense account. Somebody else pays the bills. People from another world, another country, India's poorest people. And that's what I would like to include in the excellent aspiration to do it right.
Okay, thank you, David. Michael?
So David Gray, I think, framed the challenge in his first presentation. Population growth in Africa is going to be the strongest in the world, and I think David said that at the end of this century, 1 in 3 people on the planet will be living in Africa. The challenge is really extraordinary, and yet here at the same time we have a continent which has got abundant renewable water resource which is yet generally untapped. I think it is inevitable, therefore, that resource will be tapped, and large dams will play their role in that. I think, though, that as a number of the panelists have responded to the audience, other technologies will emerge. We will find ways to mobilize that water storage more intelligently, and certainly in ways in which will involve local populations. But I want to add one other element to this, which we haven't touched on this evening. That very availability of natural water renewable resources also gives Africa a development potential in the sense of export and growth of economies through exporting food. And I think that this is another angle which perhaps we might have touched upon this evening, but which I think exists too. Thank you.
Jamie?
Thank you. I think, I mean, I very much agree with David Turton about this. I think if we can get to a point where we put as much emphasis on what is in a dam for local communities and their local development, if we give equal weight to that as we do to what the national objective is in terms of hydropower development or irrigation or foreign direct investment, if those are given equal weighting, we stand a chance of getting over this local impact hump. If it's all about national priorities and we don't mind what happens to local communities, then we're going to be seeing more bad dams in the future. And it's only by weighing up, by ticking both those boxes, both the national and the local, that we might have a hope of learning from some of the major translocations of people and the impacts on them that are very well documented, and lead everybody to talk about them rather than talking about the benefits. It'd be lovely if we were sitting here in 10 years' time talking about the benefits to local development and national development, as opposed to having a discussion which today has broadly rerun the entire process of the World Commission on Dams in an hour and a half. And that was, you know, a 3-year effort with $10 million. So we haven't actually moved far in the space of 15 years.
Right, thank you for that other cheerful note. I think we are now out of time, so I'd like to conclude by, first and foremost, thanking our panel of speakers who engaged with the process brilliantly, given the very limited time they had available. To the Oxford Water Network for hosting the event, and also for the Oxford Martin School for allowing us their wonderful facilities as part of their resource stewardship program. So thank you all very much, and next door there will be drinks. Thank you.